Well, Joanne and I went on a little date this week. When we went on our first date, it was to a big fancy restaurant 42 years ago, and this week we went to Culver's. Things have changed a little bit. So we were sitting there talking, and I said something, I can't remember what, but it was the kind of thing that a curmudgeon would say, just totally dismissive of younger people. And Joanne said, "Watch that, you're becoming a curmudgeon." And I said, "Well, I'm not a curmudgeon if it's true, what I'm saying." And she said, "Well, it isn't true. Young people are smarter than you think and more attuned than you think, and you need to be aware of that and stop sounding like a grumpy old man who has no use for anybody who wasn't in your generation." And I thought about that and realized she was right, and that I had no business at all talking about how young people didn't know anything, because up until I was 30 years old, the only thing I knew about World War II were the things I learned from watching Hogan's Heroes. A great challenge as we age is to refrain from assuming the worst about younger generations. They're usually a lot brighter and more capable than we suppose. But I was thinking about Hogan's Heroes because I heard someone use the word collaborator this past week, and it occurred to me that I had first heard that word on Hogan's Heroes when Louis Lebeau, that excitable little Frenchman, accused a fellow Frenchman of being a collaborator with the Nazis. He snarled the word, then began choking the man, so I deduced that collaborator was not a term of endearment. Eventually, of course, I realized that collaboration could also be positive, and history is sprinkled with examples of the benefits of collaboration. James Watson, Francis Crick collaborated to discover the double helix of DNA in 1953. John Lennon, Paul McCartney collaborated to write the iconic music of the Beatles. Abraham Lincoln's cabinet collaborated to save our country. And despite these examples in history, the word collaborator still conjures up negative images, doesn't it? How is it that the same word can be both sinister and positive? There's a real ambivalence about that word, which I suspect is due to our ambivalence about its practice. As important as collaboration is, we are creatures, you and I, of competition. We vie against one another more quickly and easily than we collaborate. In a culture of competition such as ours, collaboration, cooperation, and compromise will seldom be our first impulse. Note today how the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is in trouble with the far right wing of his political party for collaborating with President Biden to form a budget. We've been discussing this past month Quaker qualities, our testimonies, more specifically simplicity as generosity, peace as consistent compassion, integrity as integration, equality as democratic discernment, and today I invite us to consider community as cooperation and collaboration, as opposed to competition. I was watching recently, because I have too much time on my hands some days, so I was watching YouTube, and I just Googled State of the Union speeches, because I kind of wanted to see them through modern history, the speeches that the presidents have given. So I was watching a video of George H.W. Bush, the father, the first Bush president, giving his State of the Union address to Congress after the Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989. And he stood in that State of the Union address and announced that the United States had won the Cold War, and everyone in the chamber leapt to their feet, Democrats and Republicans alike, and cheered and clapped, and I even heard a woo-hoo or two. It reminded me of when I was a teenager and my dad took me to a Notre Dame football game. And when Notre Dame won, it was the same kind of cheering. We won the contest, like America had just won a football game. That year, 1977, Notre Dame went on to win the national championship, and my father assured me we were watching the start of a football dynasty that would go on for decades, which turned out not to be the case. For those of us who were confident that Russia had embraced democracy and would be a partner for peace after the Cold War, well, it turns out we were overly optimistic about that too. The peace dividend, if it ever happened, did not long endure. But it is a curious fact of human nature that our hearts beat faster, our moods soar higher at the prospect of competition. Bertrand Russell once said that life is nothing but a competition to be the criminal rather than the victim. And while I realize most of us don't want to be criminals, I also suspect that most of us, if we're honest, have an inordinate fear of losing, of being bested, of someone else getting the upper hand. We have an insatiable, unquenchable appetite for victory, which makes collaboration, cooperation, and compromise especially difficult. Years ago, when I realized there was more to World War II than what I had learned on Hogan's Heroes, I began reading about not only the military cooperation that led to the Allied victory, but also to the political collaboration that made possible the defeat of Hitler's fascism. I learned of the incredible friendship between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, of their deep and mutual respect and genuine fondness for one another. It wasn't one of these cases where world leaders got along because they knew they had to. They genuinely respected and loved one another. In the darkest days of the war, in the waning days of 1941, Germany and Italy were in control of Europe from the English Channel to the Black Sea. Hitler's army was besieging Leningrad. Japan had swept through the Philippines and British Malaya, forcing Hong Kong's surrender on Christmas Day. It was a dark time of history. So Churchill boards a ship and sails across the Atlantic Ocean to meet with Roosevelt at the White House, where they planned their response to fascist tyranny. It became their habit to meet late into the middle of the night, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, to talk and to plan. And one evening, excited by an idea and not wanting to wait till the next day to share it with Churchill, Roosevelt wheeled himself into Churchill's room to find Churchill naked, having just taken a bath. Whenever Joanne complains about my baths, I mention that Winston Churchill spent 2 to 3 hours a day in the bathtub all through World War II, and that when you think about it, taking a bath is actually our patriotic duty, as I see it. And so there was Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt was horribly embarrassed. He rolled out back of the room saying, I'm sorry, and Churchill said, think nothing of it. I have nothing to hide from the President of the United States. It is this transparency that makes our cooperation and collaboration possible. When our intention is to contend with others, we will always have our secrets. We will always hold back, always have one thing or another we keep from each other. But when we collaborate and cooperate, we open ourselves up. We do not mask our true and real selves. Now, as Quakers, living as we do in a time of great division, when so much seems at stake, not only in this nation, but in our world, when our progress of the past 50 years seems to be slipping away every day, just a little bit more. And we are anxious that this trend will not reverse anytime soon unless significant things begin to happen. As Quakers, we commit ourselves to making honesty and openness a priority. We have nothing to hide. We are not in a contest for political supremacy. We are in a contest for ethical dignity. We have nothing to hide. We are in a partnership for the betterment of the world. This is the Quaker vision for community. Since our first days, whether in our friendships, in our marriages, in our meeting, in our world, to devote ourselves unswervedly to the continued betterment of this nation, which requires cooperation, not competition. To do good requires many people to be united, valuing cooperation over personal gain. So there's this British musician, his name is Brian Eno, and because we live in kind of a weird culture where we think that people who are famous know things the rest of us don't, they asked this man who'd had no experience with education what he would do to transform the British educational system, as opposed to, like asking a teacher, but that's the world we live in. But he had a really good answer, Brian Eno did. He said, I believe in singing to such an extent that if I were asked to redesign the British educational system, I would start by insisting that group singing becomes a central part of our daily routine. Group singing, he said, builds character. And more than anything else, I love this part, encourages a taste for cooperation with others. Encourages a taste for cooperation with others. in true community, we learn to sing not only with one another, but with our world. Now, I try never to make a comment about our singing here at Fairfield, but that first song this morning, we have room for improvement. But the principle is important, and it's why we still sing here, because we know that when we cooperate to sing, we will cooperate to do even lovelier things.